Got a fun video for you guys today. I have a announcement of some more coverage of a big name game that's coming up, so super excited about that. I have a crazy crowdfunding story. I have some news around news and more, so stay tuned for that. All right, first of all, some beat around the bush. Shadowborn Games is making Avalon, Beyond the Veil, or something like that, or the Riven Veil. And this is a Arthurian legend slash semi-fantasy, like, map control kind of game, I believe. I don't know if it's necessarily dudes on a map or not. But you know what? I'll find out because I'll be playing it and sharing my thoughts with you. So super excited to share that with you. It's going to be pretty cool. I'm excited to learn more about it, actually get some hands-on time with it, and then tell you guys all about it. And I'm assuming that means we're getting close to a campaign launch. Super excited about that. That being said, this sign up here is for email. I'll link down to it down in the description below, so if you want to check that out. But yeah, they're doing the two type plastic with the clear and stuff like that, and it's going to be good. You guys know it. It's going to be awesome. So very excited to play that. Next up is an update from Cysmic. Now, Cysmic I've covered a few times here, and one of the cool things now is it is funded, it is real, it is, in fact, it's overfunded, and still has 12 days to go. If you recall, this was going to be a long shot. In fact, I have Sheol here as just an example of another kind of game where it's only made possible through crowdfunded, it barely funded, like towards the last day did it fund, and yet it's here, and it was actually made, and that's pretty cool. Like, I think that's awesome. And Cysmic was looking to be that way too, except it funded early. And that's because of Minnesota Killjoy here. Essentially what happened is somebody, this Minnesota Killjoy guy, bought 40 copies of the designer vision and one Wash and one planetary copy. Now, the designer vision, if we go to rewards and we go to the designer's vision all in, that was $200. So they did 40 copies of the $200, right? And he was like, is this real? Because it instantly funded the project, right? Instantly funded, and now suddenly they were doing stretch goals and stuff. Well, it turns out, no, they did not want 40. They faked it, right? And there was this back and forth around this and what's going on, and I need to cancel these pledges and all that stuff, right? So what they're going to be doing, or what they did do, I think it's done now, is to like lower it instead of just dropping it there, because then people freak out because then it's unfunded and stuff like that. They're going to lower it by like 500 per day, right? It's kind of the deal here is what was suggested here. And so they're just going to like take off a bit each time, right? And so again, then it was 162. You can see now it's at 170, right? And then it kept lower. Now it's at 161. But the point is, all of this happened, right? And it was fake. And it was not their fault. Like, somebody just up and did it. And these, I mean, technically somebody maybe have wanted 40. Maybe it's a big group pledge. Maybe it's a realtor and they didn't have a realtor option, right? There's all these options. So that's why GameFound, that's why Kickstarter doesn't necessarily stop this from happening. However, it does mean that they can kind of hijack your project a little bit. The interesting point here is that this caused it to fund on its own. The success of it, the fact that it funded, helped it reach that. Now, I say helped it because there's more to it. I mean, I've covered this before, right? It was just on its trend to do this. It has 10 updates here, right? And these updates were continually, you know, showing the behind the scenes. People were appreciative for the transparency of it, the fact that it was a realistic funding goal of 160,000, right? That all of this was there and they were having really good updates. So I'm not saying that didn't do anything. But what I am saying is that it proves the point of why funding goals are so low. It proves the point on why that happens. Now, that doesn't excuse not canceling if it doesn't actually reach the real goal, right? But people want to be part of a success. People want to be more secure, right? And when they feel if it is a success, if it is a success, then it is, right? Now, we could go on like FOMO and, oh, what's everybody interested in? That's partly it. But a lot of what it is backing these campaigns is risky. Riskier than ever before, right? I've covered this on many videos around how backers are having a huge risk. And they're often not feeling even as rewarded as they should be. And yet, once it's backed, once it's funded, now backers feel a little bit safer. Now they feel like they can actually okay, I'll hop in. This seems like a surefire thing. It's not a waste of my time, right? That's the idea here. But it is interesting to see that even an artificial, a faked out funding suddenly brings success to what is the same game. Cysmic hasn't changed. Cysmic's the same as it has been. The advertising around it has been the same that it has been. Nothing changed around the product, just around its perception. You know, when it comes to, I got some hairs flying around. When it comes to YouTube, for instance, it's all about the thumbnail and the title. The content can stay the same, but the perception of it, right? The wrapper around it is what matters. And that'll drive its success or failure almost more than the content itself, which is kind of unfortunate. But this is the same way with these crowdfunding games. The game can be great, but if you can't sell it, if you can't pitch it, if it doesn't work in the market, then it doesn't necessarily matter how good that content is, right? How good that game actually is. And that's kind of just an unfortunate truth, right? I mean, people can play these games at events all the time and expos and stuff and conventions and have a great time, but it doesn't mean it's going to sell. The marketing, the business side of it, and the game creative side of it are almost wholly independent from each other. As unfortunate as that is, it's just the way things are in the entire world in every single industry. Selling something and making something, very different things, right? So anyway, just very interesting to see that it funded at the end anyway because of that. And it continues to fund and it continues to grow. It's at 700 backers now, right? I cover this all the time. So yeah, very cool. And of course, this is linked down in the description below as well. All right, I'm going to do a little kickback to another business venture. How many of you remember Monsoon? This was funny. These are NFTs that Come On, or the owner of Come On, with some of his buddies made. In fact, they even like advertised it the same. The Monsoon logo was just like the Zombicide logo, and there was a whole lot of other stuff that just was like very, very obvious what's going on. I remember covering this, and you remember the Night of the Living Dead coming soon? It's still coming soon. It never actually happened, right? This was a quick, here, make some money, right? They were selling packs for like $400 and people actually bought them, supposedly, allegedly, I don't know, right? You go to the marketplace and it's still sketch where it's like, I don't know if this was a thing or not. Why is it taking so long to load? What the heck is up with that? So yeah, here's this abomination for $650, but if you go to like Fusion here, oh, here's a $699, right? Turns out never been sold. So like it doesn't matter. It's just a waste. You know, these things are just so interesting. Look at 17,500. Of course, again, it says sale history, it says seller, it says buyer, was no price listed. Like, it's all fake. None of this stuff is from the 22nd or more. All the names are like arbitrary. This is just a quick, quickly get some money and make some cash off of whoever we can kind of move on. And it's just unfortunate to see this in the gaming space, in the board game space. But it goes to show the industry and the types of people running it, right? So like the head of Come On is a businessman, right? Far more than a gamer, which is why he's interested in NFTs. Anybody who's selling NFTs is just interested in making money off NFTs, right? And that was kind of the whole point here, is how can I use my other company's product with a few of my other business friends to make more money? And it just, this industry is far different. You have stuff like this, like Sheol, like Cysmic, right? Where there's these companies that are just making these highly creative, very niche games. And a lot of my channel, besides the industry, focuses on these niche games, these games that are never going to be super popular. They're not going to get the 100,000 views on the game because it's super popular. No, these are like 2,000 views, right? Because there's only a small percentage of people that are even interested in this. They're even willing to watch this, that are willing to like talk about it and nerd out over these little tiny niche things. And I get that. And I'm fine with that. I love that. I love that I have a platform that can do that. But they are not representative of the whole industry. So they are a part, and in fact, a small part of the larger industry. And the larger industry is quite big, multi-billion-dollar big. Having businessmen sell NFTs around it big, trademarks, disputes, and that's what we're going to get into now. The word Meeple. The word Meeple is trademarked or is being trademarked in the U.S. We'll see. But it's because of a quote-unquote cease and desist activity from Carcassonne publisher, again, these are some of the non-niche stuff that I'm not into. Hans im Glück, and Glück, I don't know, I'm saying that wrong. I'm sure it sounds German or something like that, right? The point is that there is a trademark under Meeple, and companies are getting shut down from it, or you know, told to stop. And this is interesting. So listen to this. So Meeple Inc., which is a worker placement game, right, raised $230,000 from over 1,600 backers through a GameFound campaign in March, right? Keep that in mind. $230,000 is what they raised. This is essentially like, you know, hey, they're doing the U.S. or something here, but essentially, the Carcassonne, which is what this is, company has a trademark in the EU that's limited, and also in Germany. The German one is the important one here. That most people talk about the EU one. So what's going on? The figure, Meeple, is so widely associated with the word Meeple, was created by Hans im Glück, co-founder Bernd Bernhofer. Again, I know I'm saying these names wrong. My apologies. I'm sure you guys are all cringing, and that's okay. For Carcassonne in 2000, although the name Meeple, so in this game it was not called a Meeple, was coined after its release by American gamer Allison Hansel, who used it to as a portmanteau, I can't say any of these words, of my and people to describe her pieces while playing the game. So they didn't even make up the name Meeple, right? They had these little people in Carcassonne that you can move around, and somebody, a reviewer, a talker of it, coined the term Meeple later. But Hans im Glück did not turn its thoughts to register Meeple as a trademark until a decade after Carcassonne's release, when the word had already gained heavy recognition and usage worldwide. The company finally succeeded in registering the trademark in the EU in 2019, not 2000, 2019, again, much later, by leaning on the fact that the figure used in Carcassonne had come to be regarded as the original Meeple. That registration process featured an objection from board game publishing major CMON. See, companies can do good things. CMON, good for you for objecting on that. That's silly that come out way after the fact. But we'll get to the creation and ownership and stuff in a moment, because it's more nuanced than that, which provided dozens of pages of evidence arguing the word had become too widespread and reflective of general board game playing pieces to be trademarked as a specific style. CMON's objection was partially accepted by the EU Intellectual Property Office, which went on to approve Hans im Glück's application for the Meeple trademark across a vast sweep of products, including software, jewelry, books, tableware, and sporting goods, but not toys and games. In other words, the EU trademark does not cover boards and games. That is considered by the EU as, hey, no, Meeples are just a part of it now. Should have acted sooner than 19 years later. Hans im Glück has since, so after this, registered Meeple as a trademark in Germany for its usage, which does include toys and games. So, Germany, what the heck? What do you think it's doing over there? 2 decades later or more, they're getting a trademark on something, and also owns the EU trademark for the shape of the original Meeple. So this is precise and exact shape. Right? Now, again, you can have variations on that. They don't own every shape that's semi-similar, but they do own that shape in Germany. So, Hans im Glück CEO Moritz Bonhoeffer, everything in purple is his feedback here, says, why did they do this? Why? Well, 2 usual reasons: defense and respect. For defense, if we do not move against it, not only will people profit from their own creation without us, but also theoretically at some point, someone could claim that their brand name shape would be theirs. Which, again, if you had actually coined it, I can understand. I can understand the shape a bit more than the term. They didn't even come up with the term. They didn't make it up. It's not their creation. That's what Allison's creation, it sounds like. The shape, though, that was their creation. And I think creation is important and protecting it is important. And incentivizes it. While unlikely, it could theoretically lead to someone suing us for the use at some point. If we can't prove we are checking this, we could lose the option to use it. Yes and no. I mean, technically, a bad lawsuit could happen at any time for a huge amount of reasons. That doesn't necessarily mean that you go to other companies and like tell them to stop and stuff like that. My opinion, this one is a little bit more loosey-goosey. You could fear a lawsuit that would go poorly on any number of things, not just this, and you don't like act on all of them. But I do understand the creation thing for the shape, not the name. They didn't make up the name. And as for respect, creation should be valued. Otherwise, we will turn to a copy system only, and no creativity will be valued. The brand system is one of the main foundations of economic freedom and creation of value. Pros and cons to this. So, fundamentally, at a core level, I agree. I think that creation should be respected. I think that it should be valued, and I think that it should hold value, and that people adding creative new things to something like board games should be rewarded and should be protected so that other people can quickly copy it and sell it for cheaper or do whatever because they didn't have to R&D it, they didn't have to think it up, they just had to copy. Totally agreed on that. Now, that being said, we're talking about the name Meeple here, right? This is not some hugely creative thing. It's a name. And we're talking about a shape of a person, a very specific shape of a person. Now, I can understand you not wanting to think people have Carcassonne pieces in their games, right? But Meeples go in other shapes besides that, a humanoid representation. So I guess what I'm saying is this is not... as fundamental as it is and as used as it is, it's not some huge creative leap per se, right? That being said, the like copy system only, there's pros and cons to this. So one of the nice things about video games, so I love playing video games, and one of the great things about it is the normalcy of it, that I can go from, let's say, an FPS to an FPS, and more often than not, the right trigger shoots the gun, right? And that's not copyrighted so that nobody else can do that, because if that was the case, then you'd have, and you might remember old video games had this, especially when controllers were way different. It wasn't consistent at all, and you never knew what button did what. Typically, X is going to jump, and I just know that going into it. And if not, I can change it to that, because that normalcy allows me to adopt new games quicker, right? Common turns, common visuals, help with that. And one of the problems I have with the board game industry is it lacks a lot of that, right? Now, there are some things like exhaust or tap, which again is a whole nother trademark thing I've covered in the past. But the point is that it's a common thing that people just understand to exhaust or to tap or to use a card by turning it sideways, right? It's a very common thing that you can pick up quickly, so you can play more games quickly. And so if you can't ever use anything because everything is copyrighted and trademarked and protected and you're going to get sued if you do anything similar, then it just makes it harder for consumers to play the games. There's no consistency. When I pick up a JRPG, regardless of what it is, often it's going to have attack, it's going to have items, it's going to have magic, and it's going to have guard. And that's okay, that's fine. And you're going to pick it from a system in a turn-based game like this, and that's okay. It's okay to quote-unquote copy that because it's expected, right? The same way you enter a car is expected through a side door. You could go from the trunk if they wanted you to, but that's silly, right? So they put a little side door and everybody has the side door. It's not necessarily copying. It's just making it consumer friendly at some point, right? So I get the creation part. I do. I get the fact that we should respect that. But depending on what that creation is, regardless of the date that this is, which is silly that after the fact they go and do this, right? Is we need consistency in board games, at least some level of consistency. And these kind of like everybody's afraid to use tap or everybody's afraid to use the word Meeple is suddenly it's different, right? So I'm busy going through Dawn of Madness. Again, another very indie, very creative game that is not mass marketable, that a lot of people aren't interested in, that's only available through crowdfunding, right? Love it. That's great. And in that creativeness, right? And I had this even in the prototype review, they have all these names for stuff, right? There are no common names for it. They have a name for every type of card, for all the sentients and what those are and stuff like that. And that sort of labeling is cool. I don't know what happened to my voice. It's cool, but at the same time, it's hard to follow because it's not like any other game I've played. Right? People joke about the swords and shields and rolling dice, but it's easily understood and you can pick it up quickly, right? Swords minus shields equals damage, right? Anybody can get that and you can move on with your life. So pros and cons to that. I'm not going to go over that anymore, but let me know your thoughts on that. But anyway, he went on. Meeple Inc. raises a substantial amount of money that exceeds a lot of usually launched games, so it's not a hobby project by any means anymore. Now that's fascinating to me. Everybody would draw the line differently, right? But if we go up here, you're going to see, look at that, $230,000. So what he's saying is $230,000 of revenue, not profit, revenue, right? Exceeds a lot of usually launched games and is not a hobby project by any means. Fascinating. Because I know a lot of you wouldn't think that, but a lot of you are thinking games like this. A lot of you are thinking games like this. You're not thinking a little tiny Meeple game, right? The profit margin on a lot of these is very, very different, right? These are extremely expensive games to make, extremely complex games to make, with a lot of different manufacturing processes in place, from the miniatures to the storage trays to everything. Now, board games, regardless, are, but ones that are entirely paper or wood-based obviously go a little bit easier, right? It's a little bit nicer to do. It's just interesting to me that they're saying, hey, this amount of revenue is, again, not talking profit, is no longer a hobby project. Would you define that as a hobby project? I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. It's interesting that they're distinguishing between hobby projects and commercial projects as well. And where that line is, I'm not sure. But there's more to it. So he goes on to say, and just because we did not act on something, does that mean we should not act now? Basically, exactly this argument that there are already many others and forces companies to go hard from the beginning, which is a shame. This is actually kind of interesting. So essentially what he's saying is you're upset because we're doing this now, later. But all that shows is you're pushing somebody to do it from the get-go. Now, they couldn't do it from the get-go because they didn't have a trademark until like 2 decades later, and only in Germany because the EU took it away from the toys thing. But regardless of how strong of an ownership they have, i.e. not much, but even that's a point, right? They expect you to go at the beginning. In other words, should they have just trademarked this right away? Boom, we own this shape. Boom, we own this name. They didn't make up the name, so we're going to get rid of the name. At least the shape, right? And then in Germany, I guess they own both. But the point being that if they had just acted sooner and protected it sooner and stronger, you would not have this Meeple term that everybody uses, or this common view of a human object on the table because of the litigation and legality around it. It's almost like a self-defeating prophecy, right? Whereas people want it to be free, and so then when they do something like that, like, hey, I feel like my creation's actually being used and abused here, you're just like, why didn't you do it to other people? So then you're almost forcing the issue to do it to everybody else, which doesn't benefit as well. But it is interesting that, essentially board games wouldn't have the Meeple thing if they had just gone hard from the beginning. And would that make the board game industry better or worse? Again, I'm getting into that creative thing again, but like, honestly, do you think if we were able to control the word Meeple like this, and so Meeple never became a big thing in board games, is the industry better for it, for protecting that creativity? Or is it better to be able to create and then have people ideate and iterate on your creation? Which they can anyway. So then it's just like, how legally different can you be? Where you name it something different every time, and it's a common thing that always has a different name. I don't know. It's interesting. It's interesting. He goes on to say, just because somebody did something, got away with it before, that doesn't make it okay, does it? Of course not. You always say this, right? If just because somebody else does something doesn't mean that you're then allowed to do it and it's fine, right? It doesn't change what you did. It changes the fact of what they did and got away with it, but it doesn't make it suddenly legal or okay. Like, obviously not. Now, he said this, we will not change. That if someone asks us nicely, we will allow the use, and based on the intent to commercialize or not, proceed. There are many associations, for example, who ask for permission and, of course, can use the logo. So in other words, as long as you don't intend to commercialize, you can use the logo. They're pretty okay with you using it, in a non-commercial way. Hence why he says like associations and stuff. But if you want to have a product, if you want to have a board game and you want to use the word Meeple, not allowed. No more Meeples. Even though, again, they didn't come up with the name. Whatever. Brunoff added that he had since decided to send an apology to Joe Adams at Cost World Games, that's the name change there, for the way this went. It was too aggressive from our side. Which, I mean, again, that's behind the fact. The only thing there is, obviously, when it gets to legal grounds, lawyers are just ruthless, right? And they always will be, unless you rein them in. Now, Ryan Dancy, the COO of U.S. board game publisher AEG, who, by the way, has a Meeples and Monsters board game from 2022, says this, I think it's really hard to argue that consumers identified either of their products and services exclusively in 2017 when they filed for registration. Carcassonne was published in 2000. The Wikipedia entry named Meeple was created in 2006. By 2017, the shape and the term had become generic. In my opinion, now both are ubiquitous with tabletop gaming. I think that's what everybody feels, right? This is just something that a company's doing in hindsight to try and control and profit from something. I'm all, but again, all that's pushing there is to do it from the get-go. They should have, I don't think they should have tried to copyright it anyway. I don't think that makes much sense. Naming something is unless that is your brand, which it wasn't because they weren't marketing off this, then it's kind of useless, right? Because the CEO goes on to say that too, right? That like if they had like driven value from the term Meeple, like this is now their identifying thing, then that's one thing, right? Then it's like a Mickey Mouse for Disney kind of thing, right? Like, hey, you see Meeple and you think of the Carcassonne publisher Hans im Glück, like, which isn't the case. It is ubiquitous now, right? But if it hadn't been, if you had really driven on that, then I can understand that, right? But they didn't. And so they're just after the fact. In fact, they lost it in the EU and only have it in Germany. And are still trying to push it around. And I tire of it, right? I really am. Regardless of the balance of, you know, freedom to iterate versus controlling specific wording and stuff like that. And whether or not that should even be able to be trademarked, you know, is whatever. But if a business creates something and then really markets off of it and really owns it, then that's one thing. Coming in after the fact and then sending cease and desists to a crowdfunded campaign is just silly. It's just silly in my opinion. Dicebreaker. Dicebreaker I've covered a few times here. They were a board game journalist. Their parent company was bought by IGN, and now everybody's getting fired. Or, I'm sorry, made redundant. It's, I think, the EU way of laying off people with a nicer name, by the sounds of it. They just made redundancies. I remember covering SFG, and they had marked people as redundant, and were like very particular on my wording because I said fired. And I'm not interested in semantics. I casually speak in my videos all the time. You guys know that. This is not a script. Either way, somebody lost their job, right? You can sugarcoat it all you want. So this is by Michael Whelan, the head of video of Dicebreaker, who said, no idea what IGN will do with the brand in the future, but if you haven't already been able to tell from the multiple layoffs and no posts, the Dicebreaker as you know it is no more. Board game news website Dicebreaker has made its editor-in-chief, Matt Jarvis, and senior staff writer Alex Meehan redundant following 3 weeks of silence on the website in the wake of its parent company's takeover by IGN. He goes on to say, Dicebreaker launched in 2019 was something of a watershed moment for the tabletop gaming industry, with the creation of a dedicated site staffed by professional reporters underlying the booming nature of this hobby. By the way, this is on Board Game Wire, a website I've been showing more and more lately because they cover stuff like this. The site had also been one of the vanishingly few board game journalism outlets whose reporting goes beyond new game announcements and reviews. I've literally said this before. This is very true. Something Board Game Wire believes is hugely important for an industry which has quickly grown from a relatively small niche hobby into a multi-billion-dollar sector. Going back to the NFTs, going back to the lawsuits, right? Going back to games like Sheol, games like Dawn of Madness, right? Where there's this huge industry with indies in it and big companies that make billions of dollars, right? Even Hasbro's playing in this field. And yet, it's so hard to get coverage like this. There's only a few people on YouTube that'll say anything negative about a board game. There's only a few websites that'll say anything about a board game company without just, you know, announcing and advertising new launch stuff, right? It's so rare. It's so hard. It's interesting. Articles published on the site that otherwise may not have seen the light of day include an expose of alleged toxic workplace culture in Pandasaurus games, which the firm has denied, an investigation into the impact of Twitter's decline on tabletop creators, and the reporting of a wave of redundancies at Dark Souls and Elden Ring board game maker Steamforged. All of these investigations were the work of Carter, who in February launched TTRPG-focused journalism site Rascal News. The unfortunate part there is that TTRPG is now just, you know, more vertical slice. So here's Rascal News. I'll link to this down below too. And they do have some interesting stuff already kind of posted here and articles around that, which is kind of interesting. But because it's TTRPG-focused, again, that's now a little bit more niche, and which then leaves board games still largely uncovered. We have stuff like Board Game Wire, right? Obviously, I'm reading this right now. It's just, it's interesting that these big companies like IGN still like buy up these companies just to like fire everybody there. You know, in other words, it's buying competition to get rid of competition, not to actually like nurture it or do anything like that. They're not interested in Dicebreaker, except that they don't want Dicebreaker to take hits from them, so they buy them out and then fire them all, right? Or make them redundant, or whatever you want to call it. Which again is just a business move now in the board game space because IGN wants to cover this stuff. It's fascinating. This stuff matters, guys. These companies are not all indie, and even if they are, they're playing in a big space and always have the potential of making a lot of money. And we need good companies here, indie or not, playing in this field. We need real professionalism, both in coverage, which again, I know I'm not fully, you know, providing here as a, you know, hobby part-time thing that I'm doing with this. But we need more like this. I want to see more journalists. I want to see more people covering the industry, covering these companies, reporting on real things that matter. And we're just not. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry with almost zero oversight when it comes to journalism. Almost zero people talking about it. Almost zero people wanting to do it. And it's because it's hard, right? If we go back to Rascal News here, one of their first things here is, can anyone make a living in tabletop and actually play, right? Like, it's not just these companies. It's the fact of, you know, like covering the industry, right? How much money can you make talking bad about a company or speaking out against a company when they won't support you, right? This is an expensive industry, right? Without my patrons, without some outside sponsorships, and without the YouTube ad revenue, I couldn't even fund this hobby. Nonetheless, like, make videos for you guys each week. It's hard. It's hard. It's this weird thing where people are making a lot of money in the hobby, and yet nobody wants to look at how they're doing it, whether it's the best way to do it, whether they're doing it responsibly. Kind of interesting. So, I know this video was negative in a large way, and I'm sorry about that. I mean, sometimes we just have to talk about this stuff. And again, there's a ton of other creators doing a lot of positive things too. That being said, I do want to do a video covering stuff like Sheila and Dawn of Madness, covering a lot of these indie games that wouldn't exist without backer support, that wouldn't exist without amazing crowdfunding campaigns and companies that are dedicated to making it no matter what, even when it's not profitable. So that'll be coming out here soon. I'll be doing that, and it'll be a lot of fun to show off some of these games, to talk through it, and to really talk about how amazing crowdfunding truly can be. Because it really can be. There's a bright side to all of this. So we just want to make sure it stays bright, that it stays great, that we reduce these negatives down to as minimal as possible. And a lot of that includes coverage. Guys, thank you so much. Have a great rest of your day. Take care. Bye, guys.